It was at my high school graduation party in the cramped, but meticulously decorated backyard of our suburban Columbus home. The late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the plastic-covered tables and the smell of grilled burgers hanging in the humid Ohio air, where my mother, Linda, her voice sharp enough to slice through the congratulatory chatter, decided to make her proclamation in front of our entire extended family, my few bewildered friends, and even our kindly, now uncomfortable, neighbors from down the street. She stood on the back porch step, a plastic cup of lemonade in her hand, and said to the gathered crowd, her eyes finding mine with a cold, dismissive glare, "Look at her, thinking a diploma is an achievement. But let me tell you all, my daughter Amelia will never truly succeed. She lacks the discipline, the drive. She'll never amount to anything respectable. Never wear a uniform that commands respect in this country. She'll probably end up in some dead-end job in this very town. A disappointment I'll have to explain for the rest of my life." And the words, so public and so final, landed like physical blows, each one stripping away a layer of my already fragile self-esteem that had been eroded by years of subtle comparisons to my more athletic cousins, and my brother who was away on a football scholarship. Comparisons that happened over tense dinners in our Midwest kitchen, where my good grades were called book-smart nonsense, and my dream of a career in public service was mocked as a fantasy for people with backbone. And as the party fell into a stunned silence, my father, John, just looked at his shoes, his silence a louder betrayal than her words, and I felt the hot, unstoppable tears spill over my vision, blurring the faces of my aunts and uncles, who didn't intervene. The shame was a living thing, coiling in my stomach, tightening my throat, making the cheerful graduation decorations seem like cruel props in a play about my failure. And I remember running, not dramatically, but with a quiet, desperate haste, through the side gate, the sound of murmuring restarting behind me, and I drove my old sedan aimlessly for hours through the Ohio backroads, the hollow ache in my chest expanding until it felt like it was all I was, just a shell of humiliation and pain. And that night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, that suddenly felt like a prison cell, I made a silent, tear-soaked decision. I would leave Columbus. I would leave Ohio. I would go somewhere where the name Amelia Hart held no baggage, no history of failure, and I packed a single suitcase with the bare essentials, took the $500 I had saved from babysitting, and at dawn, without a note, I pointed my car west, driving for 2 straight days through the flat expanses of Indiana and Illinois, the radio playing static and country songs about heartbreak that felt too familiar, until I reached the sprawling, daunting skyline of Chicago, where I rented a cockroach-infested studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens were the nightly lullaby, and I took a job as a graveyard shift waitress at a dingy 24-hour diner off the interstate, serving burnt coffee and greasy eggs to truckers and insomniacs, my feet aching, my hands smelling permanently of bleach and fryer oil, and on my breaks, I'd stare out at the relentless flow of traffic on the Kennedy Expressway, the tears falling silently again, not of public shame now, but of a profound, bone-deep loneliness, a feeling of being utterly unmoored in America, a country so vast it seemed to swallow my pain without an echo. And I worked a second job stuffing envelopes in a grimy office in the Loop, surviving on stolen packets of crackers, and the occasional free meal at the diner, my body constantly tired, my mind a fog of exhaustion and doubt, wondering if my mother had been right all along, if this was all I was built for, this grinding, invisible struggle. And the Chicago winters were brutal. The wind off the lake cutting through my thrift store coat as I walked to the bus stop in the dark, my breath forming clouds in the air, each step a silent battle against the voice in my head that whispered, "Give up, go home, admit defeat." But something, a small, stubborn ember of pride that her humiliation couldn't extinguish, kept me putting one foot in front of the other. And in the rare quiet moments in my apartment, listening to the arguments through the thin walls, I would remember the exact tone of her voice at that party, and the memory was no longer a source of pure tears, but of a cold, steely focus. I didn't announce my plans. I didn't call home to rage or plead. I simply, quietly, began to change my life, one disciplined choice at a time, using my tips to buy a second-hand laptop from a pawn shop. And at that same sticky diner booth on my breaks, I started researching, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep, looking into community college programs, then federal career paths, settling finally on the one thing she said I could never do: wear a respectable uniform. And not just any uniform, but the one that represented the highest level of discipline and service I could imagine. And so I began the long, arduous, and secret journey toward becoming a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A path that required a degree, specific experience, and a physical and mental fortitude I wasn't sure I possessed. But I enrolled in online courses in criminal justice from a Chicago community college, studying at my kitchen table after double shifts, the words swimming on the screen from fatigue, surviving on instant noodles and determination. And I saved every penny, foregoing anything that wasn't absolute necessity, my social life non-existent, my world narrowed to work, study, and the fierce, private dream growing in my heart. And after 2 years of this silent, grinding work, I earned my associate's degree, transferred to the University of Illinois at Chicago, and waited tables through my bachelor's program in forensic accounting, a field I chose for its practicality and demand within federal agencies. And those university years were a blur of libraries, part-time jobs, and a deepening sense of purpose that slowly, so slowly, began to fill the hollow space her words had carved. And I started running along the lakefront trail at dawn, first a mile, then 2, then 5, building the endurance I would need, the physical pain a welcome counterpoint to the old emotional scars. And I took a low-level clerical job with the city of Chicago, just to get government experience on my RA Summe. And all the while, I had no contact with my family in Ohio. They were a ghost chapter, a silent motivator, the audience I never looked at, but whose imagined disbelief fueled my pre-dawn runs and late-night study sessions. And after graduation, I applied to the FBI, a process that took over a year of background checks, polygraphs, interviews, and agonizing waiting, during which I worked as a financial analyst for a bland corporate firm in the Willis Tower, wearing stiff suits and feeling like an imposter, but all the while honing the analytical skills that would become my weapon. And then the call came, the one that changed everything, a formal voice offering me a place as a new agent at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. And when I hung up, I didn't scream or cry. I just sat in my now slightly better apartment in Lincoln Park, looking out at the shimmering skyline, and felt a quiet, seismic shift within me, the final piece of a new foundation locking into place. And at Quantico, the training was the most brutal, challenging, and rewarding experience of my life. The pre-dawn physical training sessions in the Virginia humidity, the grueling academic work on federal law and ethics, the tactical exercises where I learned to fire a weapon with steady hands and a calmer heart than I ever had in Ohio. And for the first time, I was surrounded by people who judged me not on my past or my mother's opinion, but on my performance, my integrity, my ability to work as part of a team dedicated to something larger than ourselves. And I thrived. Not because I was the strongest or the smartest, but because I had been forged in a quieter, deeper fire of personal despair. And the day I graduated, standing in my crisp, new FBI special agent uniform under the bright sun on the parade ground, the weight of the badge in my hand was more than metal. It was the tangible proof of my silent, years-long reply. And my first posting was to the field office in New York City, where I worked on complex financial crime cases, my forensic accounting background proving invaluable. And I rose steadily, not with fanfare, but with consistent, dedicated work, earning the respect of my colleagues and supervisors, building a life of quiet authority and competence in the heart of America's busiest city. And I bought a small apartment in Brooklyn, filled it with books and light, a world away from that dark studio in Chicago. And I never spoke of my family, never sought them out. My revenge was not in confrontation, but in the living, breathing reality of my success, a success built legally, dignifiedly, piece by piece through the American systems of education and meritocracy. And then, nearly a decade after I had fled Ohio, my work on a multi-state securities fraud case required me to present evidence at a federal courthouse in Cleveland. And as fate, or perhaps poetic justice, would have it, the case garnered local media attention, and a reporter from the Columbus paper, doing a routine coverage piece, snapped a photograph of me outside the courthouse, a woman in a tailored pantsuit, a clear FBI badge visible on her hip, my expression one of focused professionalism, and the caption, which I would later see, read, FBI Special Agent Amelia Hart, lead investigator on the Carson fraud case, arrives at the Cleveland Federal Courthouse. And it was this photograph, published in the very newspaper my mother read every Sunday over coffee, that served as the unplanned, perfect instrument of my calm revenge. Because I later learned from a distant cousin, who tracked me down through the Bureau's Public Affairs Office, that my mother, Linda, had seen the picture, and her reaction was not one of immediate pride or joy, but of a dawning, devastating recognition that shattered the narrative she had built for over 20 years, and according to my cousin, she had simply stared at the paper for a long, long time, her hand trembling, before she began to cry, not delicate tears, but great, having sobs of a regret so profound it physically shook her, and she kept repeating, "My girl, my Amelia, she did it. She actually did it, and I told her she couldn't." And she tried to call me, leaving voicemails on a number I had long since changed. Messages that my cousin relayed were filled with a raw, stumbling apology, an admission that she had been cruel, small-minded, and utterly wrong, that seeing me in that uniform, an emblem of American authority and respect she herself had invoked to belittle me, had broken something in her own proud facade. And my father, John, had apparently just nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes, and said quietly, "She always had more of America in her spirit than we had in this whole town." But I did not call her back. Not immediately, because my revenge was complete in that moment of her private, emotional breakdown, a breakdown caused not by my anger, but by the undeniable evidence of my strength. And I continued my work, moving eventually to the Washington, D.C. field office, taking on leadership roles, mentoring young female agents, building a legacy that had nothing to do with the past. And a year later, I received a formal invitation to speak at a law enforcement leadership conference in Columbus, Ohio, and I accepted, not to gloat, but as a final act of closure on my own terms, and the conference was held in a large hotel ballroom. And as I stood at the podium in my full-dress uniform, speaking about ethical leadership in federal law enforcement, my eyes scanned the crowd of police chiefs and sheriffs from across the Midwest. And there, in the very back, nearly hidden by the dim light, I saw them, my mother, Linda, looking older and smaller than I remembered, her face pale, and my father, John, standing straight beside her, and our eyes met, And in hers I saw not the cold dismissal of that graduation day, but an ocean of shattered pride, regret, and awe that bordered on grief. And she lifted a hand to her mouth, her shoulders beginning to shake silently, and my father placed a steadying arm around her. But his own eyes were on me, and he gave a single, slow, respectful nod. The kind one soldier gives another, a nod of acknowledgement and profound respect. And in that moment, under the bright lights of that American ballroom, surrounded by the symbols of service I had earned, I felt no rage, no need for further words, just a deep, unshakable peace. The little girl from Columbus who was told she would never amount to anything in this country had, through silent tears, relentless patience, and unwavering resilience, not only amounted to something, but had become a guardian of its very laws. And her revenge was the life she built, the uniform she wore with dignity, and the powerful, emotional truth that sometimes the strongest victories are the quietest ones, won not with shouts, but with an unbreakable spirit that turns humiliation into honor and pain into purpose, proving that in America, your future is never written by someone else's cruel words, but by the quiet, determined steps you take long after you've walked away from them.